Assalamu alaikum. In this video we will study the arm, the new region of the upper limb. بعد ما درسنا shoulder region, the axilla and the brachial plexus. Attached with the video you will find the PDF file contains the pages from your textbook Gray's Anatomy. In this lecture we will understand the compartmentalization of the arm. يعني شلون نقسم الarm إلى compartments, and each compartment has its own muscles and its nerve supply, and the muscles have a specific action, etc. And to review the bony features of the humerus and the proximal ends of forearm bones, which are radius and ulna. راح نشوف تفاصيل bony features بهذول البونز, and finally to study the main features of the arm muscles including their origin, insertion, nerve supply and action مثل ما تعودنا بكل منطقة بكل region. So the arm is the region of the upper limb, extends from the shoulder joint to the elbow joints. Superiorly it communicates with the axilla on the medial side, while inferiorly it communicates with the forearm, عن منطقة الforearm, through the cubital fossae. وهذول two spaces, the two regions, they transmit an important structures including nerves and arteries as well as lymphatics بالتأكيد, and veins of course, between the root of the neck and the arm and between the arm and the forearm. Now, as you can see here, the arm is divided into two compartments. So if we have a cross section, such as in this figure, ماخذين cross section احنا بالarm, and here we can see the humerus, the bone of the humerus, the main bone of the arm. We can divide the muscle compartments into two main compartments: anterior compartment and posterior compartment. By what? By two intermuscular septa اللي تتصل لي the deep fascia that investing the arm with the bone, with the humerus. فعندنا two intermuscular septa, one on each side, واحدة medial واحدة lateral. بوجود الhumerus قسمت لي الarm into two compartments: anterior, which are mainly flexor muscles that flexes the forearm at the elbow joint, and the posterior compartment is mainly extensor, which extends the forearm at the elbow joint. The bone of the arm is the humerus, and the humerus is a long bone which has a proximal epiphysis and distal epiphysis, and there is a shaft. The proximal epiphysis has the spherical shaped head, and just inferior and lateral to the head we have the anatomical neck, and we have two tubercles: the lesser tubercle, which appears on the medial aspect, we can't see here because this is posterior view of the humerus, and the greater tubercle. Separating between them the intertubercular or bicipital groove, and we have the surgical neck. Here's the position of the surgical neck. The shaft is triangular in the cross section, and if we cut the shaft we will get a triangular shaped section with an anterior border, medial and lateral borders, and we have posterior surface. Now we are looking to the posterior surface, and there's an anterolateral and anteromedial surfaces. The shaft of the humerus proximally have an oblique line, oblique يعني مائل, from the anatomical neck downward and laterally reaching to the deltoid tuberosity. This linear roughening is for the attachment of the lateral head of triceps muscle. We will study it. بناخذ الextensor compartment of the arm. Just inferior and parallel موازات هذه roughened area there's a smooth shallow groove called the radial groove, also called semi-spiral groove. ليش spiral؟ لأن يفتر حول الشافت من الانterior للposterior. This groove is very important because we have two important structures, which are the radial nerve, اللي هذا نسميه radial groove. Radial nerve passes through the triangular interval، إذا تتذكرون triangular interval, from the axilla بعدين يدخل بالposterior compartment of the arm. The radial nerve and the other structure, which is the profunda brachii artery, passes in close relation with the humerus وين؟ بالradial groove. So هنا نتوقع أنه any fracture of the shaft of the humerus may result in injury to these two structures, and most importantly of course هو الradial nerve هو اللي يهمنا أكثر بالحقيقة. فأني fracture in this area، أي كسر بهاي المنطقة بالهيومرس، ممكن أتوقع برadial nerve injury. طيب, when we go distally at the mid shaft, on the medial aspect, medial because this is the head of the humerus, we have another roughened area for the insertion of coracobrachialis muscle. Distally, the two borders, medial and lateral borders of the humerus, becomes sharp and more prominent، يصيرون حادين، يصيرون واضحين أكثر، فنسميهم supra-epicondylar ridges, medial and lateral of course. The lateral supra-epicondylar ridges is more prominent and more sharp than the medial one. طيب, distally we have the rule of 1, 2, 3. هذه فد قاعدة حتى تحفظ ال structures وال bony features اللي موجودة بالdistal epiphysis of the humerus. So what we've got, we have one condyle, this articular part of the humerus, two epicondyles, two bony prominences, medial and lateral, and we have three fossae, two on the anterior aspect and one deep fossa on the posterior aspect. So the condyle on the anterior aspect is divided into two parts. The lateral part, laterally, is called the capitulum. Capita means head. فهذا الجزء من الcondyle of the humerus called the capitulum، يعني يشبه الhead, looks like a head. The medial part, which is the larger of course, is called the trochlea. وtrochlea يعني pulley-like، تشبه الpulley، يعني تشبه البكرة. When we turn the humerus on the posterior aspect, we only see the trochlea. فبس راح نقدر نشوف التروكليا مكملة على posterior aspect of the distal end of the humerus. We have two epicondyles. The medial one is called medial epicondyle, a bony protuberance, just above the condyles. This is larger than this larger one, and it can be palpated because it is subcutaneous. In fact, if you can palpate the medial aspect of your elbow, that تحسس المedial aspect of your elbow, you can palpate a bony prominence, bony projection. This is actually the medial epicondyle. This is very important because we have a nerve that passes just posterior to the medial epicondyle, the ulnar nerve, that we will study when we discuss the neurovascular bundles of the arm. So medial epicondyle is larger and subcutaneous and has got a nerve that passes behind it. The lateral epicondyle is smaller and less prominent and cannot be palpated. So let's move to the fossae. On the anterior aspect, we have a shallow small fossa above the capitulum of the condyle called radial fossa. A more deep fossa above the trochlea called coronoid fossa. On the posterior aspect, we have the deepest fossa that lies just above the trochlea. It's called olecranon fossa. So we need to study the bony features of the proximal ends, proximal regions of the bones of the forearm. We have two bones in the forearm. The medial one is called ulna, while the lateral one is called the radius. The radius, let's study the proximal end of the radius first. The radius composed of the head, a narrow neck, and the shaft, at which there is medially, the medial aspect of the radius, we have a prominent bony tuberosity called radial tuberosity. The head of the radius has a concavity at the superior aspect, is for the articulation with the capitulum of the humerus, while the surrounding border of the head is also an articular surface with the lateral notch, with the lateral articular notch at the ulna, at the proximal end of the ulna, and we will see it later on. In the ulna, it is more expanded than the radius. As you can see here, it's more expanded. There's a large notch, and at the inferior aspect of the notch, a coronoid process. This notch is called trochlear notch. And you can guess that this notch is articulating with the trochlea of the humerus to form the elbow joint. And the inferior and superior aspect of this notch, there is a large bony prominence, and posteriorly, of course, is called the olecranon. And actually, this area, this part of the ulna, is the palpable area at the tip of the elbow joint. من نتحسس elbow joint from posteriorly, من نتحسس from behind, you can palpate the elbow tip، يسموه elbow tip. بالحقيقة هو هذا الأوليكرانون، اللي نتحسسه هو الأوليكرانون، يكون subcutaneous, and all these features will be seen and discussed in the lab inshallah. On the lateral aspect of the ulna, المنطقة laterally, there is a radial notch for the articulation with the circumference of the head of the radius to form the proximal radio-ulnar joint. وطبعا if you remember at this joint هذه المنطقة اللي هو it's a pivot joint راح يصير عندنا حركة pronation and supination. Just inferior to the coronoid process, we have another bony prominence, roughening, called tuberosity of the ulna. اللي يريده هو لحد ما ناخذ تفاصيل الulna and the radius. اللي يريده منكم انه تتذكر the radial tuberosity and tuberosity of the ulna, as well as طبعا the olecranon process and the roughening of the olecranon process. فدي three bony parts بس اريد تتذكروها اللي هي radial tuberosity بالradius, tuberosity of the ulna بالulna طبعا just inferior to the coronoid, and the olecranon process of the ulna. طبعا when we set the bones together, elbow joint will be formed by articulating the trochlear notch of the ulna with the trochlea, and the head superior concavity of the head of the radius with the capitulum, and the circumference of the head with the radial notch on the ulna to complete the picture of the elbow joint that will be studied later on inshallah. The anterior compartment composed of three muscles, and this compartment also called flexor compartment of the arm because it flexes the forearm at the elbow joint. The three muscles are the biceps, brachialis, and coracobrachialis muscles. Innervation of these muscles are predominantly by the musculocutaneous nerve C5 C6. طبعا انتم مطالبين بعد بالroot value of the nerves. Each nerve you need to remember its root value. The biceps, as the name suggests, has two heads. We have a short head that arises from the tip of the coracoid process as a tendon, and then it passes through the axilla. If you remember, one of the contents of the axilla huma biceps, short head of biceps, and the coracobrachialis. We will study this later. And the long head that arises from the supraglenoid tubercle, the tubercle above the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa of the scapula, and then it passes above the head of the humerus to enter within the shoulder joint, and then passes through the groove, the bicipital groove or the intertubercular groove. طبعا this groove is spanned by a transverse humeral ligament to convert the groove into a tunnel. The tunnel راح يفوت بها a long head of biceps. If you see as if the short head is long, but the long head takes longer course than the short head. The reason why we call the long, because obviously it is the longer head. So in the proximal third of the humerus, these two tendons will convert into a belly, and at the middle of the mid shaft of the humerus, the two bellies will unite to form a large belly of muscles. This is the biceps brachii, and these muscle fibers will converge راح تتجمع to form a common tendon that crosses the elbow joint, يعبر الelbow joint, and then inserts into the radial tuberosity of the radius اللي درسناها قبل شوية. There is a band of connective tissue from the tendon arises medially. This is called bicipital aponeurosis. هي جزء من connective tissue متصل بالتندon of the biceps and passes medially on medial side and blends with the deep fascia surrounding the forearm. تندمج مع الdeep fascia اللي surrounding the forearm, and we will study this when we discuss the cubital fossa. من نحكي على cubital fossa راح نعرف the function of this bicipital aponeurosis. The main action of the biceps brachii is it is the most powerful muscle of the elbow joint, as well as it is the most powerful supinator of the proximal radioulnar joint, especially when the elbow joint is flexed. شنو يعني؟ احنا بالanatomical position the forearm is extended and the forearm is also supinated. The biceps is most powerful flexor. Flexor طبعا when the elbow is extended, of course. And at the same time it is the most powerful supinator, تسوي supination للforearm بس وقت when we already flexed, when the elbow is already flexed. فطبعا انت تقدر تجرب هسه، تقدر تسوي flexion 90 degrees 90 درجة، تسوي flexion للelbow joint، تسوي supination، تسوي pronation بعدين تسوي supination. راح تشوف الbiceps will act as a supinator, and in fact it is the most powerful supinator of the forearm when the elbow is flexed. من عندي flexed elbow الbiceps هي راح تشتغل as a supinator muscle. Innervation, of course, is musculocutaneous nerve C5 C6. The next one is the coracobrachialis muscle, and it is a relatively short muscle, also arises from the tip of the coracoid process, passes through the axilla, the lateral aspect of the axilla, and then inserts into the midshaft at an area of roughened bones on the medial side of the shaft of the humerus. Innervation by musculocutaneous nerve, which actually pierces it. Pierces يعني يخترقها وبعدين يغذيها. Of course muscle اللي يخترق nerve اللي يخترق muscle أكيد يغذيها. بعدين it will arises just beneath the biceps that we studied. طبعا البايسبس مثل ما تشوفون بما انه هي it crosses the shoulder joint, it also acts on the shoulder joint as assisting flexor muscle. تساعد بالفليكشن. ليش؟ because it passes and crosses in front of the shoulder joint. The biceps muscle crosses two joints. So any muscle crosses a joint, it has to act on this joint. The biceps crosses the shoulder, acts as a assisting flexor muscle. Coracobrachialis is mainly acting on the shoulder joint by flexing the shoulder joint. The last muscle in the anterior compartment is called the brachialis muscle, and it arises from the lower aspect of the anterior side of the shaft of the humerus, هاي المنطقة broad area, and it inserts into the tuberosity of the ulna just inferior to the coracoid process. هذا coracoid process, just inferior to it نعدي tuberosity of the ulna. The action of the brachialis is flexion of the forearm of the elbow joint. Innervation, this muscle shares dual يعني dual innervation. The majority of muscles is innervated by musculocutaneous nerve, and there's a small portion, especially on the lateral side of the muscle, is innervated by radial nerve. ليش؟ لأن الراديال nerve راح يمر بهالمنطقة هذا just beneath the brachialis muscle وبعدين يعبر in front of the lateral epicondyle, and we will discuss the course of the radial nerve later on inshallah. We have a clinical correlation here, which is relatively common, especially in individuals who use the biceps مثل heavily and repeatedly, مثل individuals اللي مثلا يسوون body building ودائما عندهم repetitive flexion of the elbow joint. قد يصير rupture of the biceps tendon خاصة the long head of biceps, especially within the bicipital groove. So repeated flexion, repeated forceful flexion راح يؤدي لي إلى tear and wear بالتندن of biceps خاصة بمنطقة البicipital groove. فهذه repetitive injury, micro injury يؤدي لي إلى rupture وتمزق وممكن قطع بوتر البايسبس muscle. ممكن طبعا يصير any area, ممكن يصير بالديستال، ممكن يصير بالشورت هيد، but the most common area of rupture هو بالحقيقة long head at the bicipital groove. طبعا مكتوب مثل ما مكتوب بكتابكم Grey's Anatomy، من أسأل المريض يجيني بحالة إنه قطع لوتر عضلة البايسبس، أسأل المريض إنه يسوي لي فليكشن، ما راح أخسر من وظيفة البايسبس الخسارة الواضحة، فما راح أخسر الفليكشن. ليش؟ لأن brachialis muscle is intact and the other head of biceps is also intact. بس اللي راح أشوفه هو من أسأل المريض إنه يسوي لي فليكشن، راح أشوف bulge of the ruptured head of the humerus of the biceps. الرuptured head راح يصير اسمه unrestrained، ما عندي هنا منطقة حتى تسحب لي المصل حتى تبين more flat، لا راح يصير عندي bulge، وهذا البولج طبعا يسموه بوباي ساين اللي هو علامة بوباي. فنشوف هنا كأنما تشبه البايسبس مال بوباي بكرتون بوباي. The posterior compartment includes one muscle that has three heads called triceps muscle. Posterior compartment also called extensor compartment. ليش؟ Because it extends the elbow joint. طبعا muscle that passes behind the elbow joint أكيد راح تسوي لها extension when it contracts. شو هم هذول the three heads? The three heads هم the long head of triceps, and we've already seen this muscle من حكينا على muscles of the shoulder region, and it takes origin from the infraglenoid tubercle of the humerus just inferior to the glenoid cavity, and it's the longest head in اسمها long head of triceps, and it descends inferiorly on the medial aspect of the humerus. طبعا crosses with the teres major, teres minor, forming, if you remember, triangular and quadrangular spaces, and also it crosses with the teres major and the humerus to form the triangular interval, if you remember. Through this interval راح يفوت ال profunda brachii artery and the radial nerve, the contents of the interval. This is the long head. The lateral head takes origin from an oblique line اللي هو يمر من الاناتوميكال neck اللي أخذناه حكينا بالهيومرس. هذا from oblique line, and then it unites with the long head, while the medial head of the triceps اللي هو صاير just anterior to the long head of the triceps, it takes origin from the posterior aspect of the shaft of the humerus, just inferior to the radial groove. فهناش عندي الارrangement راح يكون origin of the lateral head of the humerus, then radial groove of or the spiral groove, and then the medial head of triceps. فهذا هو الترتيب للعضلات والسبايرال جروف. فالسبايرال جروف راح يصير between the medial head and the lateral head of triceps. All these three heads will converge, راح تتجمع, and form a common tendon that inserts into the superior aspect of the olecranon process. Innervation by طبعا which closest nerve هو radial nerve لأن يفوت بيناتهم فأكيد راح يسوي لي innervation. Action, forceful extension of the elbow joint. This table summarizes the muscles of the arm with their origin, insertion, innervation, and action. And keep in mind that you need to memorize and remember the root values of each nerve. This is the end of today's lecture. Thank you.